Dusk was settling over North Carolina. The neon lights flickered outside Elliot's tap room off Highway 74, casting a glow that was both lively and lonesome. Country music played from an old jukebox, blending with the loud laughter of patrons, drinking beer and watching the baseball game on the big screen. James walked in, the warm air and familiar scent of beer giving him a momentary sense of relief. James had just returned from a long deployment in the Middle East. He was still in his military fatigues but had swapped his combat boots for a worn pair of sneakers to be more comfortable on the long drive back from base. His broad shoulders and close-cropped hair made him stand out among the locals in the small bar. He chose a quiet corner near the counter, ordered a cold beer, and leaned back, letting the music and buzzing atmosphere ease his tense mind. For a brief moment, James felt like he could leave behind the heavy memories of war. The sleepless nights, the echoing gunfire, and the loneliness of the desert seemed to fade away with his first sip of beer. A faint smile crossed his lips, grateful that he'd made it back home in one piece. But deep within his tired eyes lingered the vigilance of a soldier who had just returned from the battlefield. James took another sip of his beer, his eyes drifting across the room as he tried to settle into the familiar hum of the bar. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the occasional holler at the baseball game on TV. It was all so ordinary. Yet, after months overseas, ordinary felt almost foreign. He exhaled slowly, letting the cold drink soothe his nerves. Just as he began to relax, the door swung open with a loud creak, letting in a gust of cold air and a rowdy group of 6 men. They were older, dressed in leather jackets with worn patches that showed their years as veterans. Their heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor, echoing through the room as they made their way to the bar, loud and full of swagger. Their leader, John, was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and piercing eyes that seemed to size up everything they saw. As they passed, James felt John's stare linger on him a second too long. He didn't flinch, keeping his posture relaxed, even as he felt the familiar prickle of tension crawl up his spine. Settling at the bar, John leaned into his group, his voice low but pointed. They laughed, casting sideways glances at James, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something sharper, something judgmental. James knew that look. He'd seen it before, the way people's eyes would narrow when they didn't think he belonged. He tried to shake it off, focusing on his beer, but the laughter grew louder, its mocking edge impossible to ignore. From his corner, James watched their reflections in the bar's dusty mirror, their eyes flicking toward him, then back to each other. He could almost hear their words, the questioning, the doubt. It was the sneakers, he realized. They didn't match his fatigues, didn't fit the image they expected of a soldier. It wouldn't be the first time someone made assumptions about him, and he doubted it would be the last. But tonight James just wanted to enjoy his beer in peace. He took another sip, keeping his focus on the game on the TV, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But John wasn't done. His voice carried across the room, laced with disdain. Bet he got that uniform at a costume store. His buddies chuckled, their laughter grating against the country music. James's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He'd learned long ago not to rise to the bait. Still, his grip on the glass tightened as anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. After all he had been through, the months away from home, the dangers he faced, the sacrifices he made, he was being judged by a pair of sneakers. It was absurd, infuriating. But James stayed still, his shoulders relaxed, his face neutral. He had fought bigger battles than this. But as John's mocking laughter echoed through the room, James felt a familiar fire ignite within him, the first spark of a confrontation he didn't want, but was ready for all the same. James tried to ignore them, focusing on his beer and the flickering TV screen. The game was close, tied in the ninth inning, but he could barely follow the score. His shoulders were tense, his muscles wound tight, every nerve on edge. He could still feel John's stare, sharp as a blade slicing through the smoky air. The man's taunts echoed in his mind, each word dripping with contempt, each laugh digging deeper under his skin. But James kept his face calm, his body still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. He had almost convinced himself they would lose interest when John spoke again, his voice louder this time, meant for James to hear. "I didn't know they were letting just anybody wear that uniform these days," he sneered, his eyes fixed on James's back. The other men laughed, their jeers blending with the clinking glasses and low country music. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as James's chest tightened. He took another sip, the beer bitter and cold on his tongue, willing himself to stay seated. He was better than this, stronger. He'd faced worse than a couple of ignorant old men. But the sting of their words dug deep, not just because of the disrespect but because of the hypocrisy. They wore their veteran patches like badges of honor, yet they refused to see him as one of them. He could feel his patience slipping, his pulse quickening as his fists clenched under the table. Memories flashed before his eyes. Dusty deserts, echoing gunfire, nights spent wide awake under foreign stars. He had served just like they had, bled just like they had, sacrificed more than they could imagine. And yet, here they were, questioning his right to the very identity he had earned with blood and sweat. Just when he thought he could take no more, John stood up, his boots heavy against the floor as he swaggered over. His eyes were cold, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked James up and down. "You played dress-up real good, kid," John sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "But you're not fooling anyone." James's jaw tightened, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He could feel the room watching now, a tense silence settling as all eyes turned to him. He wanted to shout, to demand they see him for who he was, for what he had done. But instead, he rose slowly, his movements controlled, his expression hard, as stone. His eyes locked with John's, defiant and unyielding. "I don't need to prove anything to you," James said, his voice low and steady. "I've already earned my place." The two stood face to face, the air heavy with tension, neither willing to back down. It was a standoff, a battle of wills. And in that moment, James knew this fight wasn't just about him. It was about every soldier who had ever been judged, every sacrifice that had ever been questioned. He wouldn't let them take that away, not tonight, not ever. The silence that followed was suffocating. James stood his ground, his eyes locked with John's, unwavering. For a moment no one moved, the room frozen in the tension crackling between them. Then, Robert's voice cut through the stillness, low and taunting. "Must be nice, huh? Riding on someone else's coattails. You don't look like no hero to me." His words were laced with disdain, his lips curled into a mocking sneer. The other men laughed, the sound harsh and biting, echoing off the worn wood walls. James's fists tightened, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, anger surging like wildfire. He wanted to shout, to make them understand, to force them to see him, really see him. But he knew it wouldn't matter. They had already made up their minds, their prejudice, blinding them to anything beyond the color of his skin. His father's voice echoed in his memory, calm and steady, a lesson drilled into him since childhood. You don't get to lose your temper, not here, not ever. They'll use it against you. James took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to stand straighter, to keep his head high. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not today. but the anger simmered beneath the surface, coiled tight and ready to explode. He looked at John and Robert, at the smug superiority in their eyes, and he saw more than just two ignorant men. He saw every person who had ever looked down on him, every time his accomplishments had been dismissed, every time his humanity had been denied. It wasn't just about this bar or these men. It was about a lifetime of being seen as less. His voice was calm when he spoke, but each word was razor-sharp, cutting through the air with precision. You don't have to respect me, but you will respect my service. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. I wore that uniform, same as you. I bled for this country, same as you. And nothing you say will change that. The laughter died, the smugness slipping from their faces. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in John's eyes before he turned away, his shoulders rigid. Robert looked down, his jaw clenched tight. The weight of James's words hung heavy, undeniable, demanding acknowledgement. James exhaled, his shoulders easing as the tension began to dissipate. He had stood his ground, defended his honor without losing himself. As he turned to leave, he felt eyes on his back, but this time they were different. Not mocking, not condescending, just watching, considering. Maybe they didn't see him as an equal yet, but they saw him. And for now, that was enough. Outside the bar, the night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension inside. James paused on the worn wooden steps, his fists still clenched, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp breeze fill his lungs, grounding him. He had stood his ground, but the fight was far from over. Every word, every sneer still echoed in his mind, digging under his skin. Yet he hadn't let them see him break. He had held his head high, just like his father taught him. He started walking, his boots crunching on the gravel. The street was nearly empty, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. His hands were still shaking, adrenaline lingering. It would have been so easy to fight back, to unleash his anger on John and Robert, to throw punches instead of words. But he knew that would only prove their point. To them, he was already guilty of existing in a world they believed was theirs alone. As he turned the corner, he heard footsteps behind him. James's shoulders tensed, his muscles coiled, ready for a fight. But when he glanced back, it was John, his expression unreadable, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. James stopped, his back straight, his jaw tight. You following me now? His voice was steady, firm. He wasn't about to show weakness. John looked down, scuffing his boot against the pavement. Look, about back there. He hesitated, his gaze flicking up to meet James's eyes. I was out of line, we all were. The words were rough, forced, but they were there, hanging awkwardly between them. I didn't know you served. Didn't think. His voice trailed, off, shame flickering across his face. James felt his anger flare again, hot and sharp. Would it have mattered? His words were clipped, edged with bitterness. Would it have changed anything? John's shoulders sagged, his silence answering for him. They stood there, the night stretching long and heavy around them. John shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. My brother. He didn't make it back from Afghanistan, he admitted, his voice low, pained. I was angry, at the world, at anyone who didn't look like him. But that ain't your fault. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. For a moment, James saw him differently, not as an enemy but as a man carrying his own pain, his own loss. It didn't excuse the hate, but it made it real, human. James's shoulders eased just a little. He didn't forgive John, not yet. But for the first time, He saw the possibility of something more than anger between them. "We all got our battles," James said quietly. "Maybe it's time we stopped fighting each other." John nodded, the weight of understanding settling between them. It was a start. Not an end, but a step forward. Under the dim streetlight, a heavy silence hung between James and John. The air was thick with unresolved tension, a residue of pain and anger that couldn't simply vanish with an apology. Yet there they stood. Two men shaped by different experiences but brought together by the same broken moment. John's shoulders sagged, his bravado finally stripped away, revealing a man burdened by his own prejudices. He looked at James, his eyes tired but sincere. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice raw. "I judged you before I knew you, before I even tried to understand." James's jaw tightened, his instinct to defend himself flaring up before he took a steadying breath. He could feel the weight of all the times he'd been judged, the sting of every sideways glance and whispered doubt. But he also saw the vulnerability in John's eyes, a man struggling to unlearn a lifetime of bias. "It doesn't make it right," James replied, his voice steady but laced with hurt. "But it takes—" They stood there, shadows dancing across their faces as the streetlight flickered above. A fragile truce began to form, not through words but through a shared silence. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. James didn't know if he could ever fully trust John, but for the first time he saw the possibility of change. He saw a man willing to learn, to face his own flaws. John extended his hand, his posture unsure as if bracing for rejection. James hesitated, his chest tightening. But then slowly he reached out, their hands meeting in a firm, cautious shake. It was just a moment, a brief, uneasy peace, but it was enough. As they parted ways, James felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the cycle could be broken. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The story of James and John serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the transformative power of empathy. It shows us that biases often rooted in ignorance can lead to devastating consequences. Yet it also highlights that change is possible when we confront our misconceptions and choose understanding over judgment. In today's world, where divisions seem to deepen daily, this lesson is more relevant than ever. It urges us to look beyond stereotypes, to listen before we judge, and to engage in difficult but necessary conversations. True reconciliation doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with accountability and a willingness to change. Like James and John, we must be brave enough to face our biases and patient enough to build bridges. By doing so, we don't just heal old wounds, we pave the way for a more just and compassionate society.